So I've just recorded a special edition of charts today, really a charts tonight, because we've seen this fall in the Dow Jones index of 4.6%, down 1,175 points, and that prompted me to want to have a look at the constituent indice, stocks in the Dow Jones index. And the beauty of it is it's quite a small index, so it's quite easy to assimilate what all the constituents are doing. When it gets to bigger indexes like the FTSE 100 or the Nasdaq 100, or let alone the S&P 500 or the Russell 2000, it's quite hard to assimilate the makeup of the index. So the first thing I want to do is just click on the percentage change, and if I click that twice, it's going to rank them in order of percentage change. So here we're seeing the worst performers. Remember, the index was down 4.6%. That's somewhere in the middle. So the top half have performed worst, and the bottom half have performed better, as you might expect. That's sort of the in the middle of the performance for the index. So we start by looking at Boeing, and we see here no clear downside targets on Boeing, but it has fallen quite sharply today, has had amazing rise over the last couple of years. So just a reaction to that, really. We were much lower yesterday, in fact. Sorry, today at the last hour. So we recovered somewhat. We were right down there at one point, and we can see here the low was 317. We closed at 328. We're down 5.7%. So not great, but no clear downside targets. We tweeted today on Exxon. Remember to keep an eye on my Twitter page. My handle is @ChartsToday. So we actually tweeted on quite a few Dow constituents throughout the day today as they were falling, and we talked about Exxon. And so we're seeing here this now at the close. We do have a downside target. We mentioned this target today of 8.6% on Exxon. We have other big downside targets. So this stock is looking worse. We're below the cloud on the weekly chart, so that's bearish. Below now the medium term, bearish on all three time frames. So this is probably the worst looking stock so far, worse looking than Boeing. We're seeing here 3M. We've got a downside target a further 1% lower, but no real clear downside targets. Not quite yet below the cloud, so not as bad as Exxon. And if we look at Home Depot, again, we're seeing no clear downside targets, bearish in the short term, bullish in the medium and long term. Same is true of United Technology. No clear signs that these falls were coming. So, and the same with Pfizer. We did have some downside targets on Pfizer, which were exceeded, and we are still bullish above the trends here. But at the moment, it's still ExxonMobil that leads the charge in terms of the worst-looking stock. Interesting on Johnson & Johnson, we do have a downside target of 3.6% lower from here. We actually went to that level today. We've recovered quite sharply off that level. We've got still good upside targets, but the medium and short-term charts are bearish, so this is not a great looking position for them. Cisco fell quite heavily today, but again, no clear shortage, no clear downside targets. Still bullish in the medium and long term, so not as bad as Boeing or Johnson & Johnson. United Healthcare, we're seeing again is bullish in the medium and long term, no clear downside targets. Chevron, as you might expect, having seen Exxon, Chevron looking pretty bad as well. Downside target of 112 was given last week, and that has now been met. And so we are seeing that we're bearish below the cloud on the medium and long term charts there as well. American Express, much the same here. We're bullish above the cloud, so again, no clear downside targets at the moment. You might have to go to 1-minute charts to get really clear short-term targets before these medium to longer-term targets might develop. JP Morgan was sold off quite heavily, recovered, but we're seeing here again no clear downside targets there. Verizon is lower. Vodafone and the Nasdaq was the worst performer today for quite some time. I was watching the Nasdaq 100 where the sell-off was occurring. Verizon, we see here, we've got a 2% downside target still to go to, and we did close at our lows for Verizon. So we are seeing some relative weakness, and this chart hasn't actually looked that strong. General Electric has been looking really bearish lately. Not down as much today, but down with the market 4.67%. We've got a downside target here of a further 20% on that, and both the long term and so this is a really bad picture long term for GE. We've got downside targets of 20% on 2 charts, plus we're bearish on all 3 time frames. Travelers, much the same here. We've got upside targets, but small downside target. We're bearish in the short term. DuPont, we're seeing here bearish in the medium term and short term. Quite a lot of these stocks coming below. Here we see Nike really just falling away there, so looking quite bearish there as well. And we're seeing here Goldman Sachs. We are seeing just holding the cloud support just, but we do have a downside target of 4.5% still. Walmart below the cloud on the short term, no clear downside targets. Microsoft has had an amazing run. I own Microsoft shares up until a couple of weeks ago. Has had an amazing run for the last couple of years, but we do have a downside target of 3% here, and it is looking bearish in the short term. IBM, much the same picture as you might expect, just coming to test this cloud from the medium term, and strangely the long-term chart is actually also just starting to turn bearish, so not looking great. Caterpillar is bearish on the short term, but no clear signs on the medium and long term. Coca-Cola looking pretty grim on the medium-term chart. We still have good upside targets on the long-term chart, but we've been really flat for the last couple of years, a clear underperformer. Visa selling off, but holding the bull trend on the medium term. About short-term bearish, but no clear downside targets. You'll notice that all the short-term charts are bearish and have been for several days, which we've been calling in charts today and in our tweets. Procter & Gamble looking bearish and a downside target of 11% further, and long-term looking bearish. So a really mixed picture here. We're seeing Merck also looking bearish in the longer term, and Walt Disney. What's interesting is that we're seeing here a number of charts coming into their bearish trends in the medium term, all of them pretty well short-term bearish. Only a handful have got clear downside targets. Intel looking pretty bad on the short term, medium and long term holding up. McDonald's really had a big spike down today, but just holding its ground. But we do have a downside target of 3.5%. And Apple was the best performer in the Dow 30 today, but we've been bearish on Apple for the last couple of weeks below the cloud, calling it lower, and this medium-term chart is worrying, and we still have further downside here of 6.6%. So what's interesting when you compare that with the Dow Jones index, we have no clear downside targets on any of these charts. We're holding the medium-term trend when a lot of the constituent stocks are not. We're looking very bullish on the long-term chart when a handful of the constituent stocks are looking bearish on that long-term chart. But of course, all the charts are, like the Dow Jones index itself, bearish below the cloud. We have to wait for this to play out in the next few days. They're going to be absolutely super critical. This is a really critical week. Can we see a recovery? We're not bearish on the long term or the medium term for the index, but we are seeing some of the constituents starting to fall out of bed. Keep an eye on charts today and my Twitter handle @chartstoday, and keep you posted. Thanks. Bye for now.